At funerals, everyone does the same thing. They stay quiet, they lower their heads, and they know their place. But that day, the air in the room was different. There was weight, unspoken tension, and one man crossed an invisible line. No one intervened. No one raised their voice, until Dean Martin's presence silently shifted the balance of the room. The chapel was the kind you'd forget the moment you stepped outside. Small, wood paneling stained dark brown decades ago, folding chairs arranged in tight rows on thin commercial carpet the color of rust. At the front, a closed casket rested on a metal stand, draped with a spray of white lilies that looked too bright under the low yellow lighting. The flowers were the only thing in the room that hadn't aged. Everything else felt worn down by years of grief compressed into hour-long ceremonies. The air smelled faintly of furniture polish and something floral that couldn't quite cover the mustiness. It was the kind of place where people came to say goodbye to lives that had been lived quietly, without headlines, without fanfare. Lives that mattered to a handful of people in a handful of rooms and then dissolved into memory. The deceased was a musician, a saxophone player named William. He'd spent 42 years playing clubs, lounges, hotel ballrooms, the kinds of places where the music filled the background and no one asked the band's names. He'd been good, real good. Anyone who'd heard him play knew that. The way he could hold a note, let it stretch and bend until it said something words couldn't. The way he could make a tired, standard sound like it had just been written that morning in someone's kitchen. He'd played a gig in Atlantic City once, 1961, some hotel lounge that smelled like cigars and gin. The room had been half empty, but there was a couple in the corner, older, holding hands, and when William played, "The Nearness of You," the woman had started crying. Not loud, just tears running down her face while she smiled. Afterward, she'd come up to him and said, "That was our wedding song. Thank you for giving it back to us." William had nodded, said it was nothing, but he'd carried that moment with him for years. That was the kind of musician he'd been. Not famous, just necessary. He'd turned down bigger gigs over the years. Better money, better rooms. There'd been an offer once to tour with a band heading west. Good pay, steady work. But his daughter had just started school, and his wife had her mother living with them, sick, needing help. So he'd stayed, played the local circuit, came home every night, read bedtime stories, fixed the leaky sink, showed up. That was William. He showed up. His wife sat in the front row now, a black woman in her 60s named Evelyn. She wore a black dress that looked like it had been pulled from the back of the closet and would go right back there after today. Her silver hair was pulled into a tight bun. Her hands were folded in her lap, one over the other, and she kept her wedding ring turned inward, pressing the band into her palm like she was holding onto something she couldn't afford to lose. Her face was composed, still, but her eyes told a different story. Rimmed, swollen, the kind of eyes that had already done the worst of the crying somewhere private, in the bathroom at 3 in the morning or in the car on the way here. Now she was doing what she had to do, sitting upright, holding space, being strong for the people who needed her to be strong. Next to her sat their daughter, Michelle, 32, wearing a similar expression of careful composure. And next to Michelle, her son, Evelyn's grandson, a boy of 15 in a suit jacket that was too big in the shoulders. He kept pulling at his collar, kept looking down at his shoes. He'd never been to a funeral before. Didn't know what to do with his hands. Didn't know where to look. His grandfather had taught him 3 chords on the guitar last summer, showed him how to hold the pick, how to let the strings ring. The boy had been planning to ask for more lessons next month. Now there wouldn't be a next month. Behind them, about 40 people filled the space in scattered clusters. Musicians mostly. You could tell by the way they sat. Loose but tired, comfortable with silence but uncomfortable with stillness. A few older couples, neighbors, a woman who might have been Evelyn's sister, a man in his 70s who'd played piano with William back in the 50s. He sat near the back, his hands resting on his knees, staring at nothing. Near the middle row, a young musician named Anthony sat with his hands clenched between his knees. He was 26, played bass. He'd met William 2 years ago at a session gig, and the older man had given him advice afterward, told him to stop rushing the pocket, to let the groove breathe. Anthony had taken it to heart, started getting better calls, better gigs. He owed William for that. And now William was gone, and Anthony was sitting here feeling like he should say something, do something, honor the man properly. But he didn't know how. Didn't know what you were supposed to do when someone who'd helped you was lying in a box at the front of a too small room. So he just sat there, his jaw tight, his hands squeezing his own knuckles until they hurt. 2 rows behind Anthony, a man named Marcus sat with his crossed over his chest. He was big, 6'3", 240, with hands scarred from years of construction work. He'd grown up 3 blocks from William. Used to see him walking to gigs with his saxophone case, always nodding hello, always taking time to ask how Marcus's kids were doing. Marcus had carried William's amp up a flight of stairs once when the older man's back was bothering him. They weren't close, but they were neighborly, respectful. And Marcus had learned a long time ago that respect was the only currency that mattered. He sat there now, watching the front of the room, his jaw tight, his body tense in a way that made the chair creak slightly beneath him. He could feel the tension building, could sense something was about to go wrong. And part of him, the part that had stepped into plenty of bad situations before, was already calculating, already preparing. But another part of him, the part that had learned to be careful, to think before acting, was holding him back. He had a record. Nothing serious, but enough. Enough that if he got involved in something here, if it turned physical, he'd be the one the cops looked at first. So he sat there, arms crossed, breathing slow, and told himself to wait. Just wait. At the front, a minister stood behind a small wooden podium. He was in his 50s, gray at the temples, wearing a robe that had seen too many of these services. He spoke in the low, steady cadence that ministers learn in seminary. Words about peace, rest, the comfort of knowing the departed was in a better place. The words were fine, they always were, but they weren't landing. They just hovered in the air, filling space, marking time. People shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. A woman 3 rows back dabbed at her eyes with a crumpled tissue, but her face didn't change. Then the door at the back of the chapel opened, not loud. Just a soft click and the groan of old hinges. But in the silence of the room, everyone heard it. Heads turned. Not all at once, but in that slow ripple that happens when a ceremony gets interrupted. A man stepped inside. White, maybe 55, thinning hair combed over to one side. A suit that didn't fit right, too tight across the shoulders, the pants a little too short. His face was flushed, red. Not from heat, from something else. He had the look of a man who'd been drinking before he got here. Not stumbling drunk, but loose, unsteady in a way that made his confidence feel dangerous. He didn't close the door gently behind him. Just let it go. It swung shut with a dull thud that seemed louder than it should have been. He walked down the center aisle without looking at anyone. His shoes were hard-soled. They made sharp sounds against the thin carpet. Clack, clack. The minister stopped mid-sentence. His mouth stayed open for a moment, the words dying on his tongue. He watched the man walk past him, past the first row, right up to the casket. The man stopped beside it, looked down, shook his head slightly. "Hell of a way to go," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The room was small and silent, and his words cut through it like a blade. Evelyn's hands tightened in her lap. The ring pressed harder into her palm. Michelle put a hand on her mother's arm. The boy stared at the man with wide, confused eyes. The minister cleared his throat. "Sir, if you could please take a seat. We're in the middle of—" "I knew him," the man said, cutting him off. He turned slightly, addressing the room now. "He knew him longer than most of you. Played with him in the 50s, Jersey, Brooklyn, all over." He looked back at the casket. He was good, real good, but he never knew when to quit. He shook his head again, slower this time, never knew when to take the better gig, always too damn loyal. The room was frozen. People stared. No one moved. Evelyn's breathing had gone shallow. Her daughter's grip on her arm tightened. Anthony, sitting in the middle, felt his stomach twist. He wanted to say something, wanted to stand up, but his legs wouldn't move. His throat had closed up. All he could do was sit there, hands still clenched between his knees, and feel the shame of his own silence pressing down on his chest like a weight. Marcus uncrossed his arms. His hands moved to the armrests of his chair. His fingers curled around the metal edges. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on the man at the front. Every instinct in his body was telling him to stand, to walk up there, to put a hand on the man's shoulder and guide him firmly toward the exit. But his feet stayed planted. His body stayed seated because he knew what would happen next. The man would resist. Words would be exchanged, maybe a push, maybe worse, and then Marcus would be the problem, not this disrespectful fool. Him. So he stayed in his seat, his knuckles going white against the armrests, and hated himself for it. The man at the front kept talking. I tried to tell him. 57. I said, "Come with me to Vegas, real money, real rooms." But no. He wanted to stay here. He gestured vaguely toward Evelyn without looking at her. Wanted to stay close to home. And look where it got him. He paused. Let the words sit there. 40 years playing dives for pocket change. What kind of life is that? The silence that followed felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Evelyn's breath hitched. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She was gripping her own hand so hard now her knuckles had gone white. Michelle was shaking. The boy looked like he might cry. Near the easel, a woman named Barbara sat with her purse clutched in her lap. She was 58, a neighbor. She'd known Evelyn for 20 years, brought her casseroles after William died, sat with her in the kitchen while she cried. And now she was sitting here, 10 feet from this man, listening to him disrespect William's memory, and she wasn't doing anything. She wanted to. God, she wanted to, but what if he turned on her? What if he made a scene? What if she made it worse? So she just sat there, staring at the back of the seat in front of her, her face burning with shame, telling herself it wasn't her place. The minister tried again. His voice was firmer now, but still uncertain. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is inappropriate." "Inappropriate?" The man turned on him, his face flushed darker. "I'm telling the truth. That's what's inappropriate." He laughed, a short, bitter sound. He wasted his talent, wasted his life. Could have been somebody, could have made real money, had a real career. But he settled. He looked around the room, his eyes sweeping over the faces staring back at him. He settled for this, for all of this. Chairs creaked. Someone's breath caught audibly. Eyes dropped to laps, to floors, to anything that wasn't the man speaking or the family sitting in the front row absorbing every word like blows. A woman in the third row closed her eyes and turned her face away. A man near the back gripped the chair in front of him until his fingers went numb. Near the back, the funeral director stood against the wall. His name was Mr. Carver. He'd been doing this job for 30 years. He'd seen fights break out at services, seen families scream at each other over caskets, seen grief turn people into strangers. He knew he should step in, should escort this man out before it got worse. But the man wasn't being physically threatening, wasn't touching anyone, just talking. And if Carver put his hands on him, if he made it physical, the man could push back, could make this whole thing explode. So Carver stood there, arms crossed, jaw tight, watching, waiting, hoping someone else would handle it first. The man at the front wasn't done. He turned back to the casket. His voice dropped, but it was worse that way. Quieter, more personal. "You know what the saddest part is." He looked at Evelyn now, actually looked at her. "He could have given you a better life, a real house, real security. But he was too proud, too stubborn, and you went along with it." His mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile. 40 years of struggling, was it worth it? Was his integrity worth watching him die tired? Michelle's hand tightened on her mother's arm, so hard her fingernails dug into the fabric. The boy's face had gone pale. He was staring at the man with his mouth slightly open, not understanding why no one was stopping this, why the adults were just sitting there. Evelyn hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, but her chest was rising and falling faster now. Shallow breaths, the kind you take when you're trying not to break. The man tilted his head, studying her. "You sitting there all dignified now, playing the grieving widow. But you knew he was throwing it all away, and you let him." He shook his head slowly. "That's on you too." He paused, and something crueler crossed his face. "Maybe if you'd pushed him harder, he'd have made something of himself. Maybe he needed a wife who wanted more than." He gestured at her, at the room, at everything. "This." The air stopped moving. Anthony's hands started trembling against his knees. Marcus's chair scraped against the floor as he shifted forward, his breathing audible now. Barbara pressed her hand harder against her mouth, her shoulders shaking. Someone in the back row let out a small, strangled sound. The minister's face had gone ashen. Even Mr. Carver's arms had dropped to his sides. The room had stopped breathing. And then the air in the room changed. It wasn't loud, wasn't sudden, but something shifted, a temperature drop, a tightening. People felt it before they understood it. The pressure in the room redistributed. The weight moved. The door at the back opened again. This time, no one turned right away. They were still staring at the man at the front, at Evelyn's face, at the casket. But the silence deepened, thickened. And then, slowly, awareness spread through the room like a wave. Someone had entered. Dean Martin stepped inside and closed the door behind him without making a sound. He stood there for a moment, still, his hands loosely clasped in front of him. He wore a dark suit, perfectly tailored, and a black tie. His hair was combed back. His face was calm, unreadable. He didn't look around the room, didn't acknowledge anyone. He just stood there and looked at the man standing beside the casket. The man at the front was still talking. And I'm not going to stand here and pretend it was noble. It wasn't. It was stupid. It was selfish. And now she's got to live with. He stopped. Not because someone interrupted him. Not because he ran out of words. He stopped because he felt something. A shift. A change in the air. He turned his head slightly, glancing toward the back. And that's when he saw Dean. His mouth stayed open. The words he'd been about to say disappeared. Dean didn't move, didn't speak. He just looked at him. His gaze was steady, calm. But there was something in it that cut through the noise and the bluster and the false confidence like a scalpel. The man at the front blinked, looked away, looked back. He opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. Every person in that room was now watching two men. One who'd been speaking without consequence. One who hadn't said a word. And somehow, impossibly, the balance of power had already shifted. You could see it in the way people's spines straightened, the way breath returned to lungs, the way eyes that had been cast down now lifted, cautiously, toward the back of the room. If you were standing in this room right now, would you do the same thing? Hit the like button. I want to see how many people are truly brave. Dean took a step forward, then another. His movements were slow, deliberate, unhurried. He walked down the center aisle the same way the other man had walked it minutes ago. But everything about it was different. His footsteps were soft. His posture was relaxed but upright. He didn't look at anyone else. His eyes stayed on the man at the front, and the man couldn't look away. By the time Dean reached the third row, the man's face had changed. The flush was still there, but the confidence was draining out of him like water from a cracked glass. His hands, which had been gesturing broadly, hung loose at his sides now. His shoulders curled inward. Dean stopped walking. He was still 8 feet away, but it felt closer. He stood there, hands clasped in front of him, and waited. The silence stretched. 5 seconds, 10. The man's breathing grew audible, uneven. The man opened his mouth. I was just. Dean shook his head. Once, slowly. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't loud. It was almost gentle. But it stopped. The man, like a wall, had appeared in front of him. The silence in the room was total now. People weren't just watching. They were holding their breath. Anthony, still sitting in the middle row, felt tears burning at the edges of his eyes. He didn't know why. Barbara, across the aisle, had her hand pressed to her mouth. Mitza? Carver, still standing near the back, had straightened up, his arms no longer crossed. Marcus was leaning forward in his seat, his eyes locked on Dean, something like relief flooding his chest. Dean took another step forward, still slow, still calm. He stopped beside the front row, directly across from Evelyn. He turned his head and looked at her. His expression softened, just barely. He nodded, a small, respectful acknowledgement. Evelyn's breath caught. Her eyes, already red, filled again. She nodded back, her lips trembling. Dean turned back to the man at the front. Then, without hurry, he walked past him to the casket. He stood beside it for a moment, his presence filling the space the other man had violated. He reached out slowly and placed his right hand on the edge of the casket, his fingers resting there with quiet reverence. He bowed his head. His lips moved, just slightly, just for a second. A private word, A goodbye. The man who'd been speaking took a step back. Then another. His face had gone from red to pale. His hands were shaking. Dean lifted his hand from the casket and turned, his movements unhurried, and looked at the man one more time. He still didn't say anything, didn't need to. The man was already moving, stepping back, his hands coming up like he was warding something off. "I didn't mean." His voice cracked. "I'll just—" He gestured toward the door. "I should go." Dean didn't respond, didn't nod, didn't move. He just watched as the man turned and walked quickly toward the exit, his footsteps loud again but different now. Clumsy, hurried, ashamed, the man pushed through the door, and it swung shut behind him with a soft thud. The room exhaled. Dean stood there for a moment, his eyes on the closed door. Then he stepped back from the casket and turned to Evelyn. He nodded again, deeper this time. She nodded back, and this time a tear slipped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Michelle squeezed her mother's arm. The boy reached over and took his grandmother's hand. Dean walked back down the aisle, his footsteps quiet, and took a seat in the last row. He sat down carefully, straightened his tie, and folded his hands in his lap. He looked ahead at the minister, who was still standing frozen at the podium. The minister blinked, cleared his throat, looked down at his notes. "Let us continue," he said, and his voice was steady now. The service resumed, but it was different. The minister's words landed this time. People listened. A man in the fourth row wiped his eyes. A woman near the front smiled sadly at something the minister said about William's kindness. And then, softly, from somewhere in the middle rows, someone began to hum. Little. A melody. One of the standards William used to play. Bodie and Sold others picked it up, not loud, not intrusive, just a quiet, collective hum that filled the chapel like warmth. It wasn't planned, it just happened. And for a moment, the room felt less like a place people came to say goodbye and more like a place people came to remember. Dean sat in the back and listened. He didn't hum, didn't sing, just sat with his hands folded, his face still, his presence a kind of anchor. When the service ended, people stood and began to file out. They stopped by Evelyn, offering hands, hugs, quiet words. She accepted them all with grace. Michelle stood beside her. The boy stayed close. Dean waited until the room had mostly emptied. Then he stood and walked toward the front. Evelyn saw him coming. She stood, gently releasing her grandson's hand, and stepped into the aisle. Dean stopped in front of her. For a moment, they just looked at each other. "Thank you," she said quietly. Dean shook his head. "I didn't do anything." "You did." Her voice broke slightly. "You did." Dean didn't argue. He reached out and took her hand in both of his, held it. Not too long, just long enough. Then he let go, nodded to Michelle and the boy, and turned toward the door. Outside, the sunlight was harsh. The sky was clear and blue and the air was warm. A few people stood in the parking lot, talking quietly, smoking. They looked up when Dean stepped out, recognition flickering across their faces, but no one approached. He walked to a dark sedan, parked at the far end of the lot, and got in. Inside the chapel, Evelyn sat back down. Michelle sat beside her. The boy sat on her other side. They sat in silence, looking at the casket, at the lilies, at the empty chairs. Anthony walked past on his way out, paused, then turned back. "Mrs. Hayes," he said quietly, "your husband, he changed my life. I just wanted you to know." Evelyn nodded, her eyes filling again, and Anthony walked away feeling like he'd finally said something that mattered. Marcus stopped too, his big frame filling the easel. He didn't say anything, just put a hand on the back of the pew where Evelyn sat, nodded once and left. Barbara came last, her face still wet with tears. She knelt beside Evelyn's chair and took her hand. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up," she whispered. Evelyn squeezed her hand. "You're here now," she said. "That's what matters." One by one they left, and the chapel, which had been filled with tension and shame and silence, now felt different, lighter. Not because the grief was gone, but because something else had been added: dignity, respect. The memory of a man who'd shown up when no one else would. Who was that? The boy asked again, his voice small. Evelyn didn't answer right away. She kept looking at the spot where Dean had stood, where he'd placed his hand on the casket, where he'd bowed his head. "Someone who understood," she said finally. Michelle wiped her eyes. "Do you think Dad would have liked that?" Evelyn smiled. "Small, sad, real. Your father would have loved it." They sat there a while longer, the three of them, in the quiet chapel. Outside, cars pulled out of the lot one by one, heading back to their lives. The world kept moving, it always did. But in that room, for just a little while longer, time was still, and the people who'd been there that day would carry something with them. Not pride, not triumph, just the quiet, uncomfortable knowledge that silence has a cost. And sometimes, the only thing standing between dignity and disrespect is one person willing to be present. If you stayed until the end of this story, it means this kind of storytelling speaks to you. Not everyone stays, but those who do know why. Subscribe to the channel for what comes next. There are many more stories to tell.